Today's webinar, Trauma-Informed Care to Unaccompanied Children, Culture, the Migration Journey, Trauma, and Assessment is part of the Trauma-Informed Care, Understanding, and Addressing the Needs of Unaccompanied Children webinar series. Next slide, please. This webinar was developed in partnership by Dr. Lisa Fortuna, Director of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Boston Medical Center, Ms. Saida Abdi, Director of Community Relations at the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center, and me, Dr. Alicia Miller, Research Associate, also from the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center at Boston Children's Hospital. For today's webinar, Saida and I will be presenting. Dr. Fortuna will be presenting on the Spanish language version of this webinar. This webinar is the first of the series. We offer it as a foundational webinar, one in which we provide information related to the intersection of culture, the migration journey, and trauma and assessment. We will make recommendations for providing trauma-informed, culturally responsive, and child-friendly care for individuals who have direct contact and individuals who supervise those with direct contact with unaccompanied children. Next slide, please. After today's webinar, we hope that you will be able to understand the concept of cultural humility and its importance when working with unaccompanied children, provide an overview of the migration journey, including exposure to potentially traumatizing events in each phase of migration, describe a theoretical model of child traumatic stress, and recognize the importance of gathering a comprehensive, culturally responsive, and child-friendly assessment. Next slide, please. Now I would like to turn over the presentation to my colleague, Ms. Saida Abdi.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. I would like for you to take a moment to consider your various identities and group membership. As you look at this, consider, first think about your age, your ethnicity, your group membership in terms of country of origin, the state. Think about your religion. Think about socioeconomic status. Think about your profession, your education, the roles you play in different spaces and different contexts. As you think about those, next slide, please. Take a moment to consider how those identities, your membership in those different groups and those various identities affect what your relationship is to them, to those identities. For example, what your relationship is to these various identities, how your relationship to those various identities change over time. Consider how your various identities impact how you interact with others. For example, how you interact with those who belong to the same groups or the same identities and those who are different. How those various identities may impact the way you think about health and well-being. How they influence the way you think about your community. Next slide, please. So when thinking about trauma and how we work with populations with trauma, it's really important to keep in mind the role of culture. Although much is known about trauma and youth generally, there are problems in applying this knowledge broadly to all groups. This is because our cultural beliefs and practices affect many aspects of the experience of trauma, including symptom expression. The way we show that we have been affected by trauma is culturally bound. Help-seeking patterns or behaviors, for example, who and where and when we go for help, is culturally bound. The meaning ascribed to trauma is culturally bound. Whether we think this is something that we don't deserve that happened to us, or maybe we think it is God's will and that we have to bear it because this is what has been chosen for us by God, therefore we should not look for help, is culturally bound. The type of trauma we experience is culturally informed. For example, a child who was brought here from Africa as a refugee by other family members may have a very different trauma experience than a child who crossed the border with someone who is not a family. Culture also informs how we experience bereavement, loss, how we think about, how we experience, how we express loss. It informs how generations pass trauma from each other. So a parent who had a trauma who speaks about it, maybe culturally that's because people talk about bad things that happened, but some cultures it may be never share with your child bad things that happened to you in the past. It also affects how we adapt, how we actually integrate or not integrate, how we adapt to a new culture, and what our relationship is to our older culture. So that is also cultural bound. So even though trauma is in itself a really important concept and experiences to think about, how culture interfaces with trauma and the symptoms of trauma effect is really important. Next slide, please. And in thinking about that, it is really important to think about how do we provide a culturally responsive care, right? How do we, and before we actually move towards talking about cultural responsive care, it's important to understand what the concept of culture is, to have a definition of that. I love this Octavio Paz's description, which is that culture is a society's style. It is a way of living and dying, attitudes towards women, children, older people, and strangers, enemies and allies, eternity and present, the here and the now and beyond. Really, what that really means is that culture is everything. Culture frames our every interaction we have, every relationship, every experience, and so on. So it is really important when we're working with diverse communities, when we're working with children who are immigrants and refugees and unaccompanied minors, that we keep in our mind that our interactions are framed through the lens of culture. So providing services to diverse and urban communities requires that we are culturally responsive. And why is that important? Because many times service providers come from different cultural backgrounds. They don't speak the language, they don't understand the cultural experience of the populations they're working with. Also because there is a stigma in immigrant and refugee communities around mental health and help seeking, going to strangers to get help for mental health symptoms and mental health distress. And as providers, we need to understand as much as possible cultural values and beliefs around trauma and trauma experience of the clients we are working with. Also, there is a huge health disparity, and a lack of cultural competency, a lack of cultural responsive care can increase that health disparity. We do not want to promote disparities. We want to reduce it, so that is why it's important. Mental health is also a very unique service. It requires a relationship, alliance building, and if we don't pay attention to people's ways of making meaning, their ways of being, then we cannot support them. And also failure to consider cultural issues in services can adversely affect the quality of care, outcomes, satisfaction of our clients, and ultimately it can actually affect cost. Next slide, please. So one thing when we talk about, many of us are familiar with the concept of cultural competence because hopefully our organizations have done that. And that requires that we learn about the cultures as we talked about, that we understand the cultures we serve. But for us, we have also come to really like and talk about the concept of cultural humility. What we like about cultural humility is that it challenges us to look at ourselves, our own beliefs, our own practice, our institutions' practices, and make changes so that we are responsive to the community's needs, to our clients' needs. So just not to just learn about the other, but learn about ourselves. There are elements of cultural humility that are important, including commitment to self-evaluation, self-critique. I always think of it as, instead of asking, why are they not coming? Why are they not accepting the service? Ask, what can we do different? What should we do? Why are we not able to engage this community? Recognizing and acknowledging power imbalances, again, even with children, thinking about how we can give them more autonomy, we can include them in the decision making, and that also with communities and other that we work with. And developing a mutually beneficial partnerships with communities that we work with. and working towards institutional accountability, making our institutions responsive, accountable to the communities we serve. Next slide, please. I have already spoken about cultural humility in a detail, so we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So when we think about cultural humility, we talk about what we call glasses. So think about what color are your glasses. When talking about cultural competence, cultural humility, we use the example of assuming that cultures are different cultures wear different colored glasses, and that's how we see the world. So we can never take our glasses off. So if I'm wearing, my cultural color glasses, I see the world through those. So imagine if I came to you and I said, I see the world and it's all red. And really, I don't like it because it reminds me of bad things that have happened to me before. And you said, Saida, what are you talking about? I see the world and it's all blue. Blue is a beautiful color because it reminded me of a beautiful sunny day and the ocean in the summer. And I said, no, you're wrong. Why can't you be honest with me? The world is all red. And red reminds me of blood and the bad things I've seen before I came here. And you said, I don't know why you're always so negative, Saida. The world is blue, and blue is really a good color. Just give me your glasses. I want to see what you're looking at. And I am wearing red glasses, and you're wearing blue glasses. So you took my red glasses and said, let me see. I want to see what you are seeing. And you put my red glasses, over your blue ones. And what do you see? Those who are familiar with the primary colors will know you will see purple. And you say, Saida, we're both wrong. I see purple. Of course, now you see another world. Imagine, cultural humility is, from the beginning, if you said, Saida, tell me more about your red world. And if you listen to my story, my experience, not because even though it doesn't match your world, the world you see is the one I see. Cultural humility is saying, from the beginning, tell me more. Tell me more about your red world. What does it look like? Are there good things in there? How can I help you with that red world? I'm learning my experience from me, not by telling me that your world is different and that I should see the world the way you see it. Next slide, please.
A refugee is a person who is outside his or her country of nationality or habitual residence, has a well-founded fear of persecution because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and is unable or unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country or return there for fear of persecution. An immigrant, on the other hand, is a person who voluntarily leaves his or her home country for better economic, educational, or other opportunities. An asylum seeker is a person whose request for sanctuary has yet to be processed. An unaccompanied refugee minor or an unaccompanied alien child is a child who is under the age of 18, who is separated from both parents and is not being cared for by an adult who by law or custom has responsibility to do so. An undocumented immigrant is a person without legal documentation to reside in the U.S. Next slide, please. The top 9 countries of origin most represented among unaccompanied refugee minors in 2018 and served in the U.S. unaccompanied refugee minors are Guatemala, Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea, Honduras, Burma, the majority of those coming from Burma are Rohingyas, Afghanistan, Mexico, Somalia, and El Salvador. The top 3 countries of origin most represented among unaccompanied minor child program in 2018 and served by that program are Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Next slide, please. Over half of the refugees worldwide are children under the age of 18. Next slide, please. The main reasons for fleeing countries of origin among refugees are identity being targeted, religious, national, social, racial, political persecution, war, community violence or extortion or rape, gender or sexual orientation, hunger, climate, or poverty. Next slide, please. Here we see a map of Central America, and you can see Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, which are represented among those children in the unaccompanied alien child program. Next slide, please. Main reasons for leaving the Northern Triangle are increasing territorial control by organized criminal and armed gangs or groups, domestic violence, direct threat of harm and or forcibly disappeared or murdered a loved one being either forcibly disappearing or being murdered, threats or attacks after failure to pay extortion fees, children recruited and killed by armed groups, targeted for suspected or actual involvement in rival criminal groups, threats to police or government authorities and their family members, abuse, abandonment, or neglect by parent or adult caregiver, poverty, hunger, lack of education and employment opportunities. Next slide, please. Now, here we can see the comparison or difference in the last several slides. I defined unaccompanied minor child, generally noting unaccompanied minor refugees and unaccompanied minor alien children. I'm just talking about how they were different. As defined by both groups are children who are fleeing their home countries and have no parent or guardian in the U.S., but they differ in multiple ways. First, the reasons they have fled are varied. Unaccompanied refugee minors may have fled due to fear of persecution, whereas unaccompanied alien child may have fled due to poverty or drought or lack of opportunities or domestic violence or desire to be reunited with a parent who is already in the United States. Lawful status and corresponding rights and benefits in the U.S. depends on the type of migration, how children arrive in the United States, for example, and the official recognition by international law. For example, as we spoke about refugees, the status of refugee is one guaranteed by the United Nations, so under international law. Of the unaccompanied children arriving in the U.S., very few are unaccompanied refugee minors. With refugee status, which guarantees them resettlement in the United States. So very few of the children arriving in our borders are actually children who already come with that status of refugee, which gives them rights. As we saw earlier, unaccompanied refugee minors come to the U.S. from many countries around the world. And those children have rights, for example, to apply for what we call lawful permanent residence or a green card after being here for 1 year. And they have access also to a lot of resources and benefits. The vast majority of unaccompanied children arriving in the U.S., however, are unaccompanied alien children or UACs. UACs enter the U.S. by themselves. They come from countries. They can come from any country, but the majority are coming from those countries that we've talked about in the Northern Triangle that we previously talked about. They do not have a legal status and are considered undocumented once they arrive here. UACs may apply for asylum once they are here, but few of them actually do so. The majority of the UACs do not qualify for long-term immigration remedies. Of those that do qualify, the most common legal option is to apply for special immigration juvenile status. Youth with special immigration juvenile status have been abused, are youth who have been abused, abandoned, or are neglected by at least one parent, and they are then dependent on the juvenile court. USCs who have this SIKS status may become eligible for the unaccompanied refugee minor program. Those are also programs are different programmatically. For example, an unaccompanied child, alien child, has no parent in the United States or a legal guardian in the U.S., and it's not available. There's no one available to actually provide care or physical custody. The unaccompanied refugee minor has no parent or relative in the U.S. who is willing to provide care. They may also have parents here, but they may not be able to care for them. So that if there's a family breakdown, for example, then the child's parents are actually here, but they are removed from the home. There's also a difference in the immigration status. An unaccompanied alien child or children have no legal immigration status, but unaccompanied refugee minors do. They may have a refugee or asylee status. They may be Cuban or Haitian entrants. They may be victims of trafficking. They may have They may be used as recipient or special immigration juvenile, as we talked about juveniles. Custody. So an unaccompanied alien child is actually under federal custody, while an unaccompanied refugee minor is often either under state or county or a private agent's custody. Location. There are 14 states plus 100 plus sites that have foster care for unaccompanied alien children. There are 15 states and 22 programs that handle unaccompanied refugee minors. The average stay of custody or in the programs are also different. An unaccompanied alien child may stay in temporary care for about approximately 35 days, while an unaccompanied refugee minor child may stay in the program is much longer. For example, up to 3 to 4 years, depending on the age when they enter. The outcome of how they terminate or end these programs are also different. An unaccompanied alien child may be reunified with their parents who may be already here and did not have custody before. They may be released to a sponsor parent or family or another, or they may be transferred to the URM program. They may be repatriated to their original country of origin. They may attain legal status and in that way get out of the program. They may actually end up in that URM program in that case, or they may age out. And a child in the URM program, depending on the state, you could be in the program for up to age 24, receiving benefits and support, and they may also choose to terminate that program after the age of 18. Next slide, please.
Now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Saida. So Saida did a wonderful job telling us about the various groups of unaccompanied children that are here in the United States, where they come from, and the common reasons for leaving. Almost all the reasons that she listed fall under the umbrella of what are referred to as potentially traumatic events. Events like these can have long-lasting effects on the way a child or adolescent thinks, acts, feels, and behaves, as well as have an impact on his or her sense of self, relationship with others, and how he or she views the world. It is important as adults and providers in the lives of these children to develop a trauma lens, or in other words, to recognize that past exposure to potentially traumatic events may actually impact a youth's current reactions and behaviors. So when a youth reacts and behaviors are not what we are expecting them to be, we need to shift our thinking from asking ourselves, what's wrong with this child, to what is this child's perception of what has happened or is happening to him or her. Next slide, please. So for unaccompanied children, exposure to potentially traumatic experiences can be categorized into different phases: pre-migration, during migration, and after migration. In pre-migration, traumatic experiences may include direct exposure to or witness to violence, traumatic loss of loved ones, sexual assault, torture, lack of access to basic needs and resources, and separation from loved ones. During migration, traumatic experiences may include long, dangerous journeys on foot, living in refugee camps, which are often crowded and dangerous, displacement, loss of and separation from family, living in strange homes and unknown locations, death of family and friends, rape, assault, being forced to work, and coercion. Post-migration, traumatic experiences may include community violence, separation of country, poverty, health concerns, and possibility of pregnancy from rape. And finally, the pervasive uncertainty of what is happening now in real time, in addition to uncertainty about what will happen in the future, could certainly be added to this list. Next slide, please. There are also a number of core stressors that add to the challenges of adjusting to a new country and culture. We group these into 4 different types: trauma, acculturation, isolation, and resettlement. Resettlement. The act of being in a new country can itself be a core stressor for unaccompanied children. They must navigate financial and employment challenges, as well as new legal and healthcare systems. These changes and the pressures they bring can add tremendous amounts of stress to the lives of youth in the new country. Trauma. Unaccompanied children who have experienced potentially traumatic events, such as war and violence, may suffer post-traumatic stress symptoms long after these events have occurred. Symptoms can include nightmares, depression, hypervigilance, or the inability to trust other people. These symptoms can create a variety of challenges for youth, including disrupted sleep and inability to focus and form normal social relationships. Acculturation. Unaccompanied children must adjust to a new country and culture, including new cultural norms, language, food, and customs. Adjusting to these changes can be stressful and become a source of conflict. Isolation. Unaccompanied children may experience feelings of personal, cultural, and economic isolation in a new country. These feelings are often accompanied by feelings of loneliness and alienation. Discrimination and other forms of marginalization can also intensify these feelings. Next slide, please. To understand traumatic stress, we need to turn to the brain. Next slide, please. So what is trauma? From a psychological perspective, trauma occurs when an individual experiences or witnesses an intense event that threatens or causes harm to his or her emotional or physical well-being. An event is considered traumatic when it is sudden, unexpected, or non-normative, and it exceeds the individual's perceived ability to meet its demands. It is both subjective and developmentally and culturally bound. This means that an individual's perception of an event determines the meaning assigned to it and whether it is considered traumatic. This perception is influenced by where a child is in his or her development, how old he or she is, as well as the cultural context, the way his or her culture may impact perception of an event and or the cultural meaning associated with that traumatic event. Next slide, please. After a traumatic event is experienced, people may experience some strong emotional and or physical reactions, which we refer to as traumatic stress. Traumatic stress is about survival in the moment. So traumatic stress is mediated by survival circuits. When confronted with danger, we tend to choose one of 3 responses: fight, flee, or freeze. These responses are how our body protects us, and it keeps us alive because it's all about survival. Next slide, please. This is a representation of what normally happens when we're confronted with a threat in our environment. Initially, a threat is detected, and then we decide how important that threat is to our survival. We then determine if it's a real threat to our survival or not. And then finally, we take action. We freeze, we fight, or we flee if it's a real threat. Or we go back to doing whatever we were doing originally if it's not. Next slide, please. Looking to the process that's actually going on in the brain, what we just described when there was no actual threat is often called the high road. And that refers to when we're confronted with a threat, it is detected by our sensory relay system, or station, the thalamus. And then our frontal lobes take over, and they're responsible for the more sophisticated functions like organizing and planning behavior. They allow us a more accurate appraisal of the threat and be processed by the amygdala, or the emotional processing center, and leads to our response. So the bottom line is survival circuits are adaptive. So if I'm faced with a real threat, the fact that I feel afraid and run away is adaptive. It keeps me alive. Survival circuits are adaptive unless they are triggered in non-threatening situations. Next slide, please. So for those who have traumatic stress and are focused on survival in the moment, they may take the low road. This means that when confronted with a threat in their environment or reminders of their past trauma, that information gets relayed to and activates their emotional brain, essentially bypassing their frontal lobe or cortical processing before they react. The more someone takes this low road, the more it's used. And we see this a lot in children who have experienced forced displacement and the experience of migration. Next slide. So if traumatic stress is mediated by survival circuits, then what are survival circuits regulated by? They are regulated by safe, consistent, and healthy relationships. Next slide, please. All right, so let's pull together everything that we've learned so far about the migration experience and traumatic stress. Let's imagine for a moment how Josefina here might feel upon her foster parents being late to pick her up. Here she is, waiting to be picked up, and her brain takes a moment to assess the situation. What are the threats in her environment? And she asks herself this question: why haven't they come to get me yet? Next slide, please. Why? Why haven't they come to get me yet? In an ideal way for her to look at the situation would be to assume they're late, there's lots of traffic on the road, or they must be stopping to pick up pizza for movie night later. Given her history, and given what we know many kids in their country of origin have faced, it's certainly plausible for her to be thinking, they died in a car accident. I am supposed to be alone, all alone in this world. Or they hate me. They wish I was never part of this family. Next slide, please. So why is that the why? Why is that Josephine's why? There are subtle interpersonal signals that people send each other all the time, wittingly or unwittingly. These signals can be signals of care or carelessness, safety or danger, love or hate. We all have a balance of positive and negative signals in our lives, and we base our expectations of the world largely on this balance. Next slide, please. So what kind of signals has Josefina been getting? Her father was frequently drunk, enraged, and violent. Her mother was scared and vulnerable, frequently blaming her for triggering his violence. Adults have often seen Josefina as disobedient and called her a troublemaker. Josefina has learned that people are generally hostile, unhelpful to her, and more likely to hurt her than help her. Her world is saturated with trauma reminders. And the worst part is that these trauma reminders are often unintentional. We often don't mean to send signals of danger or carelessness or hate. But it's sometimes hard not to when we don't stop to think about the context. Next slide, please. The remedy for signals of hate are signals of love, and the remedy for signals of danger are signals of safety. The remedy for signals of carelessness are signals of care. And these signals of care usually communicate warmth, empathy, and positive regard. Caring interpersonal signals can remedy the emotional dysregulation created by provocative, threatening interpersonal signals. So our job as adults in the lives of these children is to help build a critical mass of signals of care across our system of care. Next slide, please. So helping us to achieve the creation of signals of care across the system of care for unaccompanied youth are the principles of trauma-informed care. And these principles are understanding trauma and its impact, which we just did, promoting a sense of safety, supporting control, choice, and autonomy, sharing power, ensuring cultural competency and humility, integrating care, assisting and making connections, and believing in recovery as a process that's possible for all. Trauma-informed care is an approach to service provision that assumes that an individual is more likely than not to have a trauma history. The intention of trauma-informed care is not necessarily treatment or intervention on traumatic stress symptoms. Rather, it is to provide care in a way that is accessible and appropriate to youth who may have experienced trauma by reducing potential threats in their environment and ensuring that they are not being re-traumatized. 3 important steps to providing trauma-informed care is practicing cultural humility, ensuring physical and emotional safety, and establishing trustworthiness. Trustworthiness builds over time and is established through action like maintaining consistent boundaries and being clear about expectations and roles. Trauma-informed care allows youth to feel safe, respected, informed, connected, and hopeful. Next slide, please. Now, as we think about how to implement trauma-informed care, it is also imperative to consider the migration journey, how the migration journey may have impacted each of these principles. For example, promoting a sense of safety must be understood in the context of a legacy of mistrust and abuses by adults and authorities that unaccompanied children have endured. Next slide, please. Culture should also be considered. The differences and similarities of cultures in terms of experiences, expectations, and values. Next slide, please. Another help in achieving the creation of signals of care across the system of care for unaccompanied youth is conducting child-friendly assessments. So what does that mean? A child-friendly assessment means that information is adapted so that the child can understand. This means that information is gathered not only in a language that the child understands, but also is gathered according to their developmental stage. Information should be gathered using child-friendly language that is adapted based on the child's age, maturity, language, gender identity, culture, ethnicity, clan, tribal membership, and family socioeconomic status. In addition to adapting the language to be suitable, use open-ended and reflective questions whenever possible. Minimize the length of text that you're presenting the child, and use easy vocabulary and pictures to assist. It also means that you are transparent about you and your role, that you inform the child what your role is and what your professional responsibilities are. Be clear with the child about what is confidential and what is not. It also means that you're transparent about the assessment itself. Explain what the child can expect before, during, and after the assessment. Explain what is voluntary and not voluntary, and what will be done with the information. Pay attention to nonverbal communication, theirs and yours. Be mindful of your body language, tone of voice, posture, and eye contact, and the interpersonal signals that you're sending. Most important is to build a trusting relationship, and this takes time. Next slide, please. Finally, Another way to help in achieving the creation of signals of care across the system of care for unaccompanied youth is following best practices for working with interpreters. So this means using a professionally trained interpreter. Avoid using children as interpreters at all times. Brief the interpreter prior to a conversation about what the goals are. Recognize that there are at least 3 relationships in the interpreting interaction: you, the child, and the interpreter, each with your own glasses. Sit in a triangle shape facing one another to open channels of communication to improve accuracy and effectiveness. Speak directly to the child, not the interpreter. Speak clearly and in a normal tone. Allow for more time for the interpreter to translate what you're saying. There are many words that do not have a direct translation in other languages. Be aware of cultural and developmental factors that may be impacting the conversation. Refrain from using metaphors, acronyms, slang, or idioms as they are culturally bound. Debrief with the interpreter afterwards to see and determine what understanding you have and if there was any nonverbal communication you should have been aware of. In addition to attending to your own experience, attend to the child's experience too, just as when we talked about assessment. Introduce the child to the interpreter and explain the roles each of you play in the situation. Provide information about what's going to happen and what information is confidential and what is not. Next slide, please. So we thought we would take a moment to help you in your work and highlight a resource that may be useful for you. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network's Refugee Trauma Webpages. These webpages provide information about refugees and their experience of trauma, including basic definitions, a description of refugee core stressors, and recommendations related to screening, assessment, and intervention. Information and resources are available for multiple audiences, including mental health professionals, healthcare providers, school personnel, policymakers, and more. Although focused on refugees, we believe the information provided in these pages are useful for work with unaccompanied minors and others coming to the United States, just like Saida had explained, that although there are different names, the experiences are similar. So go to NCTSN.org and look for the refugee trauma under trauma type. Next slide, please. All right. Thank you so much. And now we are going to take some questions. So our first question is, and I will defer to my colleague Saida to respond first. How do we respond to children who do not want to share their traumatic experience?
That's actually a very important question. Thank you, Dr. Miller. I think one of the pitfalls of thinking about trauma, because we want to attend to children's trauma experiences, is that we may start with the trauma rather than the relationship. So while it is really important, and this whole training is about thinking and having a trauma frame, I think as you interact with children, unaccompanied minor children, and any children you're working with, it is really important to remember that the sharing of the trauma is not the most important thing. As you interact with these children, the most important thing is the 3 things that Dr. Miller mentioned, which is creating a very safe environment where someday, hopefully, they will be able to share their trauma experience. It is building a relationship. It is being consistent. It's being available. It's actually helping children develop the skills that they need so that they can tell and share their trauma history in a safe way. So helping them learn self-regulation, how to calm themselves down when they are reminded of the trauma, who to go to create a safe space where they can go and talk to someone. So it is building that relationship, creating that safe space, helping them develop the skills that they need so that when they do share, that they can come back to a healthy place, that they can manage the emotions that those reminders invoke. So I think as you work with those children, if they are not sharing, they are not ready. And if they are not ready, it's not the time. What's most important thing is to focus on all those other things rather than the sharing of the trauma. Would you like to add something, Dr. Miller?
I love what you said, and I agree. I think what you were really highlighting were trauma-informed principles that we were just talking about around safety and sharing power and giving autonomy and control. So I think I'd just like to reiterate, that it's really important to understand that just because a youth has experienced trauma doesn't mean that he or she needs to process trauma in order to move forward and to be healthy. So if they're coping well, let it be, right? Let things lie the way they are. Yeah. I also think, it's really important to respect a child's silence. If they're not ready to talk, reassure them that you're acting in their best interest and that you don't mean to put pressure on them. But also respect that child's subjective truth, right? It might take a while before they feel safe enough with you to tell what has happened and to deviate from an original story where nothing has happened or that they just don't want to share.
I want to just add one more thing, which is that if you're asking that question, you might be saying, well, because I see these symptoms, it will help me maybe if I knew what the trauma was. But actually, it is more important to say to help the child manage the symptoms, so teach them skills, so that, because many of our children that we're working with actually have multiple traumas. So even when we get to the point where they can tell a trauma story, it becomes which one? Is it the one that drove them from home, or is it the one that they experienced in the process of getting here, or is it the one that they may have experienced here? And so I think if you're thinking about the symptoms, then focus on that. If you're thinking, if you see the child dysfunctioning being affected by those trauma reminders, think about what can I do in this child's social environment? What are the things that are triggering? So you can do a lot of work without focusing on what the type the trauma was or if they share it or not.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. So our next question is, do you have any recommended best practice language when assessing a child's trauma history? All right, I'll take this first. All right. So, this is interesting because I really want us to be thinking about what we've talked about regarding trauma-informed practice, having a trauma lens, a developmental lens, and a cultural lens. So it really depends on the age of the child, how you're talking with them. With a very young child, you might be drawing pictures, you might be having a whiteboard or showing them pictures or having them draw a picture. I think what's most, though, is the context of the relationship, like what we talked about. Relationship is first. So really thinking about how are you creating a sense of safety for this child, right? Do they feel safe with you? What kind of signals of care are you giving them? Are they signals of love and care? Are you using open-ended questions, reflective questions? So I don't know if there's a real this is the language to use, but more it's about creating a safe enough space and then allowing the child to talk. And that's,
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Miller and with Alisa. And I think the one thing that, as you spoke, that came to me was a lot of the work we do is around language and culture and the difficulties, as you spoke about with the interpreters, of translating. So, for example, I one time was doing a training for a group of people who do trauma work, and from different languages. They were cultural brokers, and I asked them, what is the word for trauma or PTSD? And many of them, their language, they did not have those words. So I think, again, thinking about what are things that will make sense across culturally. for example, in our work, we actually talk about things that are difficult, things that are painful, bad things that have happened, rather than the one word like trauma, because if you're using an interpreter, that may not translate. So making it relevant to that culture, to that community, and actually even asking people you work with who may be from there, so how do you talk about trauma? I think, again, overall, it is understanding that you want to use concepts and words that make developmentally make sense, but that also culturally makes sense, and you want to get at the thing you want to get at. So it's not by using one word. I use the idea of a car hitting you. So I talk about if a car hit you and broke your leg, that's an injury. And so I actually talk about trauma in a similar way. And then again, that's with adults. With children, or younger children, I may talk in a different way. So making it very concrete and experientially relevant for the person you're talking to and the community you're talking to.
Mm-hmm. Another kind of concrete recommendation can be when you're talking to kids who cognitively can be in a place to understand what's happening. I would say like age 7 and over, just as typical development, but that obviously can vary depending on the child. You can say, I've talked with other children, and these are some of the types of traumas or events, I guess, experiences that other kids I've talked to have had, and then you can list them out, and that doesn't embed that in the children's experience, but it lets them know that other kids do experience these scary things and that they're not alone. And it can be very validating for a child to understand that. But recognizing that story could change over time as trust is built.
Yep.
Right? Anything
else? No, perfect. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question. And so our last question here is, can one assume that a child is traumatized because of trauma experienced in their home country and throughout the perilous migration journey?
That's a really great question. Yeah. And I think it's an important question for practitioners and people who work with kids, whether with unaccompanied minors and other children who have experienced trauma. A person can be exposed to trauma, so yes, most of the children you're working with will have had an exposure to trauma, but they may not have the trauma effect. In other words, they may not have the symptoms. So PTSD, depression, if we're thinking about, and they may not have it now. It may not be showing now. They may have it, but it may show up another time. I love that Alicia said, stories change over time, but actually the manifestation of those traumatic experiences also may take time to show themselves. So we don't assume that a person has symptoms of the trauma, but we assume many of those children have been exposed to trauma. So what does that mean as someone who is supporting those children or working with those children? Meet the child where they are. If a child comes to you and they're functioning very well in most of the social environments, keep supporting them, make them feel safe. Don't go and try to make them process their trauma. If that trauma may come up at a certain point in their lives, or may they just keep going and doing well. I know I've spent 20 years now working with refugee children. Many of them takes a long time for them to try and speak about their trauma, because the most important thing actually right after those traumatic events is to have a normal life, and that's what they're working on. So assume that they have had trauma experience, not necessarily that they have symptoms related to that experience.
Yeah, I would totally agree. In fact, 15 to 40% of those individuals who have been exposed to trauma will go on to develop traumatic stress, right? So people respond in different ways. There's a percentage here that will go on to develop a traumatic stress reaction, but others might feel depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, all those sorts of things, and some may, a large percentage, might not experience anything. So the good news is that people overall are very resilient, and it's important to remember that the group of unaccompanied children that you are interfacing with are probably some of the most resilient people you will meet in your life. They have left everything to come to the United States, and they've made it. And so that is a marker of absolute resilience.
Absolutely. And I think it's linked to that is to remember that this training is not, or the trainings we do, or what we learn about culture, trauma, the experience, how it affects, how it looks like when children are showing the trauma effect. It's not about assuming that 100% of the children or everything, 100% of those children will show symptoms, or that as providers, as caregivers, we have to be assume that those children will have an impact from that trauma. It is to be aware. It is to be aware, so when we see youth either experiencing emotional distress or showing some behaviors that we think, again, I think the Alicia started with, we are asking why are they like this, to have that list, to have that trauma list, so that you can recognize, but also that you recognize that we don't add to that trauma, that those children are so resilient that they have come out, out of very painful journeys and traumas and losses. And when they get here, if we're aware of that, and we provide those safe spaces, that caring relationship, that trusting, consistent relationship, then we're giving them the best chance that they will continue to thrive. And so the training is caring for those who show symptoms, but it's actually to have that awareness, to have that lens, so that we are constantly aware of what they have experienced, what the potential implications might be of that experience, and what we can do to reduce the negative impact of those negative experiences.
Thank you, Saida. So this concludes today's webinar. I would just like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Lisa Fortuna and Ms. Saida Abdi, for partnering with me to develop this webinar. I would also like to thank each of you for joining us. Please remember to log on to the NCTSN Learning Center and complete the evaluation and continuing education post-test for this webinar. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.